This is part 3 of probably, it looks like it's going to be 4 parts, finishing up chapters 2 and 3. And we talked about Jamestown in the first one. We talked about tobacco and the rise of slavery in the second. In this one, I want to talk about the variations on Virginia, because the southern colonies are nowhere near as homogeneous as the northern colonies. Sorry, forgot to set my timer there. Okay, and then hopefully have some time left to talk about Southern society and Southern families, which again are very different than Northern families. Um, the main thing to remember in America is that unlike Europe, where there's a lot of labor and land is hard to get, in America, land is abundant, very easy to get, including a lot of free land, and labor is scarce. So, particularly in the South, what they're trying to do is corral their labor. They are, in most cases, attempting to set up the same social classes, the same society, the same large estates that they knew in England. These are very different people. These were the younger sons, or oftentimes the very wealthy men themselves, or younger sons of wealthy men, who are coming to recreate their system in America, unlike the Puritans, who are all pretty much middle class and families. So the variations there, I am starting with, let's see, slide number 26. And the variations are very clear from the beginning. Maryland, which adjoins Virginia on the Atlantic side, is identical in the economy. They are growing tobacco. They have large estates. The one difference between Maryland and Virginia is that Maryland for a long time was dominated by Catholics. If you remember that Catholic Protestant thing that was going on in England for a long time, Maryland was founded in a period where the king was Catholic. I think it was a James. It was named after his wife, Mary, who was also Catholic, but not the Spanish one. So, in order to create a haven for Catholics, because the church religion of England was Anglican, or Church of England, the Catholic king granted Sir George Calvert, who later became Lord Baltimore, hence you have Baltimore, Maryland, 6 million acres, a huge piece of property, and total control of his own kind of private colony. So, if you look at that next slide, I think it's a very, very interesting one. The Calvert, that's a portrait of George Calvert, the founder of Maryland. Take another close look at it. He has his little son there, and the son is holding up a map, of course, of the territory he was granted. And interestingly enough, in the background there, you have a little African slave boy as well. So we know right away what's going on in Maryland, also dependent on tobacco and slavery. The goal was to create a Catholic refuge, also to create profits, but a place where Catholics would not be persecuted. So again, you have this concept America was founded for religious freedom. Yes and no. Many Catholics did come, but very quickly they realized there's not going to be enough of them. And in 1649, they opened Maryland to any Christians who wanted to come and settle there. And many Protestants did come. They established the same large plantation system. They tried to discourage indentures. That didn't work very well. And pretty soon you have slave labor as well. Like Virginia, 10% of the population owned 70% of the land. 80% of Maryland owned no property, even worse than Virginia, the ratio. Then you can look at the next couple of slides of North Carolina and South Carolina, and you can see from the geography why these colonies developed the way they did. What happens is that settlement from Virginia slowly spreads south. So I don't care about the dates of these colonies, but Maryland is founded next, and North and South Carolina in the 1660s. Carolina is the Latin name for Charles, Carolina. So we know during whose reign the Carolinas were founded. King Charles granted a very large area to an 8-man company. It was a company intended to make profits. In North Carolina, they had a problem with this because the soil is fairly sandy. It was not as rich as Virginia and Maryland. It has a huge coastline, and I actually drove along that coastline last Christmas vacation, a gorgeous coastline, but the whole coastline is basically a sandbank. So there are no good deep water natural harbors here because the sandbank keeps shifting with every storm. This became an immediate area for pirates to hang out with, for people to get waylaid, for ships to be sunk. There were very few large navigable rivers going to the coast. So what happens in North Carolina is that it is taken over by poor small farmers. You can't grow tobacco there. The climate is fine, but the land is not suitable for it. So people from Virginia and Maryland, those poor indentures that were cheated out of their 50 acres, moved south to the Carolinas. And instead of being crop raisers, they started doing what you do with land that isn't good enough to farm. You graze livestock on it, particularly cattle. And within a couple years, people are writing back to England and saying it is, and I'm quoting, common to have 1,000 to 2,000 cattle in one man's possession, which was unheard of in England. So this becomes grazing land. Small farmers, poor farmers, people raising cattle. The big export crop from North Carolina is cowhides, which are a good commodity in Europe. South Carolina is very, very different. North Carolina has mountain ranges too. If you look at it, a lot of the western part of the state is mountainous. These are where Appalachian people went to live. We call them, and did for a long time, hillbillies. A long time they got into the mountains and they never left. If you want to hear Shakespearean English from the 1600s, go to small towns in the Appalachians today. They speak a purer form of English than we do because they didn't change. South Carolina, founded about the same time, is very different. There is very little mountainous terrain. There is a much better coastline. The soil is very rich and very fertile, and it is a very warm climate. A lot of rich, marshy, wet soil, good harbors, good large rivers. So what do you grow in wet, moist places with good soil? Rice, sugarcane, later a few other crops, but rice and sugarcane being the two. Sugarcane was brought in by British settlers straight from the British West Indies, from the Caribbean. Some of these islands had been settled by British. They had introduced slaves almost immediately because the Indians were wiped out very quickly. And when they came to South Carolina, they brought the sugarcane, the rice, and the slaves that knew how to grow it with them. It was set up as a private company by these guys and reverted pretty quickly to a royal colony controlled by the king. By the time of the Revolution, South Carolina is sending back to Britain 35 million pounds of rice a year and a whole lot of sugar. Minimum, you needed 30 slaves to grow sugar or rice. Some of the worst and highest death rates, the shortest lifespans in the rice and sugar fields. Why? Wet, damp, malaria, what grows in swamps? A lot of snakes as well. So the death rate was very high in South Carolina. It is the only colony to have a majority black population, a few large landowners, and a high percentage of African Americans, 60 to 70% before the Revolution. Our image is the whole South was full of large plantations. Not true. Very different in North Carolina, for example, much lower percentage of slaves. All Southern colonies had slaves. South Carolina is the only one that had a majority black population because of the crops they grew. One of the key figures in South Carolina, and a person we never hear about in early American history, was a young woman. She was born and raised on a Caribbean sugar island. Her father happened to be the governor of this sugar island, wall-to-wall sugarcane plantations. She was educated in Europe because there were no schools on the island. And at the age of 16 or 17, her father's brother died, her uncle died, in South Carolina, where he had established some sugar plantations. The father cannot leave. He is governor of the island. So he sends his eldest child. He had a couple of sons, but they were very young. He sends Eliza Pinckney. She comes to South Carolina. She is running 2 sugar plantations for her father, and she is in charge of the slave labor, how to allocate the labor, supervises the slaves, supervises the gardens to feed herself, the family, and the slaves, takes care of all the livestock on the place, does all the medical care, does the bookkeeping, the buying and the selling and the ordering from England of all the things. And she is more productive, and her plantation is more profitable than all of the men-run plantations around her. The catch to this, she's 17 years old when she arrives. And she is better organized and a better businesswoman than any of the men in her county. She lived on the plantation. She married. She had a number of children. 2 of her sons are very prominent in American history. One of them ran for vice president twice, the Pinckneys, Charles Pinckney. And as she's managing this plantation, being an excellent manager, she notices that sugar you plant, and unlike tobacco, does not need constant labor. You plant it, and then it pretty much sits, and you harvest it months later. So she has a labor force that doesn't have a whole lot to do for months of the year. So she begins immediately experimenting with things like rice and figs and silk, none of which are very good in South Carolina, but she hits on a plant that she had brought from the Caribbean, indigo. And indigo is a deep bluish purple dye. Grew beautifully because the conditions were about the same. When you boil it down into a dye, it is permanent, it is easy to ship, and that color was very difficult to get as a dye in Europe. She started exporting it. Soon everybody around her says, whoa, let's grow this one too. And from South Carolina, 1 million pounds of the dried blue dye are sent to Europe every year. If you remember, cochineal, which was a Native American crop, colored the British uniforms. Indigo, the blue, colored the French uniforms. So she has 2 sons that become famous generals in the Revolution. One was vice president candidate twice. She does some things that other people couldn't have gotten away with. She taught her slave children on the plantation to read and write. This was technically illegal. On the other hand, who knows what's going on? Nobody knows what's going on other people's plantations. Nobody said anything about it. So, a very interesting woman that we never hear about. The last colony is Georgia. Named after, not surprisingly, who's king at the time? King George. And the key figure here is a great humanitarian of the 1700s, a General James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was an educated gentleman, high-class guy. He had served in the military, in the British military. He was, after his retirement from the military, he was elected to Parliament in the 1700s, 1722. While he was in Parliament, he was put on a commission, a parliamentary commission, to investigate the conditions of prisons. And you can imagine what prisons were like in the 1700s in Britain. It was pretty much a death sentence. He is appalled by what he finds. He immediately leads a reform movement to help better prison conditions, which is successful. He becomes a national hero as well. Everybody knows his name. As a result of this prison commission that he served on, he goes to King George II, and asks in 1732, give me a place in the New World, give me a grant of land that I can set up a humanitarian colony for prisoners and criminals so that they have a second chance. The guy is a true humanitarian. King George thinks about it and is totally delighted. If you look at the map, look where Georgia is and look what is south of Georgia. Florida. Who owned Florida? The Spanish. And there is constant fear in England and in America that the Spanish are going to invade and seize back some of that territory, or really unclaimed territory in southern Georgia. So the king is delighted. Okay, we will send our prisoners and our refuse from the prisons to Georgia, and they will serve as a buffer in between our very profitable South Carolina sugar and rice plantations and Florida, which is a constant menace. So he gives Oglethorpe a very large land grant, and they have complete control. He has a private colony essentially for 21 years, run by a group of trustees headed by Oglethorpe. Not exactly a democracy. They have no, like Virginia had, House of Burgesses, they have no representative assembly. It is run by a group of guys. It is the only colony that got any government funds from the king, because he did pitch in a little bit of money to empty his prisons. He thought this was a great idea, much cheaper to send them there than to pay to keep them in prison. There was no need for any taxes in Georgia because the king was helping support it, and the land had been granted for free. There was no need for any government because it was controlled by this small group of guys. Oglethorpe is a humanitarian. He came with very detailed plans. He picked Savannah as the capital. Savannah today is one of the most beautiful cities in the South. It was not destroyed during the Civil War, and it is laid out exactly as Oglethorpe planned. It is laid out on a grid with these little neighborhood parks in the middle of every square. It's a gorgeous little city. But when you handed out the land, he gave every prisoner who came 50 acres for a family or an individual. But you couldn't buy or sell or exchange the land. It was held by the company. So, and the land would go back to the company if you only produced daughters. If you had a son, the son could continue to live on the land, but otherwise it went back to the owners. This is a built-in problem. Why would I work like a dog for 20 years on this property when I could go to South Carolina or even North Carolina or Virginia and pretty much get land for almost nothing? So that's a built-in problem from the beginning. Other problems with it is this is not exactly your grade A colonists. Very poor quality. Most of them were prisoners. They tried to interview those they sent to make sure that they had some skills, that they were not in for terrible crimes like murder. Most of them weren't. Remember, this is a time when there are 200 capital offenses in Britain, including stealing a chicken was a capital offense with a death sentence, stealing a pair of boots, stealing a loaf of bread sometimes. Children were locked up as young as the age of 8 or 9 for stealing a loaf of bread. So they don't exactly get grade A colonists. They got, as I'm quoting Oglethorpe, those who had been useless in England were inclined to be useless in Georgia likewise. 1 out of 4 was under the age of 10, not exactly productive colonists. The rest were used to being prisoners and were not inclined to work like dogs in Georgia. The third thing that was a problem with Georgia is that Oglethorpe was a micromanager. He lived in the colony. He lived just like the other colonists. He lived in a tent just like they did for a number of years. He respected the Indians. He dealt well with them. But he had planned this colony, and you didn't have much variation from it. One of his big mistakes is he immediately forbid 3 things. And the textbook mentions these, so my punchline is gone. He forbid alcohol. Drunk people aren't productive. Impossible. First of all, it's impossible to police. Second of all, everybody was drinking in England. They're going to continue drinking. The second thing he forbid, which I think is very interesting, and he's the first guy to see what Jefferson saw later. He forbid slavery. Again, serious problems with this. He forbid slavery. His logic was, and he's the first to recognize this, slavery makes white men lazy. If they have slaves, they will not do the work themselves. Slaves were also a problem. They could be dangerous if there were revolts. There were problems with runaway slaves going to the Florida territories. So he said, no slaveries. That lasted about 5 years. There was no way you could compete economically without slave labor in Georgia. It is much more mixed crops, too warm and muggy for tobacco. They did grow some rice and sugar cane along the coast, basically mixed crops, but not big farms most of the time. These are prisoners. The last thing he forbid, which I think is the most interesting, was lawyers, which the book doesn't mention. Why? Every man should be able to defend himself in an English court of law. Any good citizen could represent himself. That also didn't last too long either. Pretty soon you have lawyers and alcohol and slaves all over the colony of Georgia, and it becomes very similar to South Carolina, except in the types of crops they're growing. Southern society, unlike New England, is very unstable. New England was very stable because lives were long. They came as families. You have multi-generational households. In the South, the key factor is an extremely high death rate, as the textbook points out. 30% of children died before their second birthday. Half of them didn't reach adulthood. This is twice the death rate of New England. The average lifespan was about 45 years. Compared to 65 or 70 in Massachusetts. So you don't have too many older people to carry on knowledge and to distribute knowledge. Particularly high death rate among women. Not only did they have the disease factor, but they also have the childbirth factor, and childbirth could be a deadly occupation. Wives in the southern colonies were not called wives, they were called my now wife, because the average husband had 3 to 4 wives. They just died. They went through a lot of women. Average marriage lasted 9 years because usually the woman died or one of the two partners would die. Most children, 75% of kids, lost at least one parent by the time they grew up. 35% had lost both parents by the time they were 15 or 16. So who raises all these kids? Extended families were the rule in the South. They are taken in by relatives. So a family might include husband, wife, their kids, their brothers, his brother's kids, his wife's nieces and nephews, grandparents if they survive that long. They may have an uncle who's unmarried, a lot of different relatives in the household, not nuclear families. Average man was about 10 years older than his wife because multiple wives. And women married yet much younger than in Massachusetts. It was not at all rare to see 16 and 17-year-old brides. In New England, 20, 22 was the rule. Lots of marriages within the family. 12% of Southerners married first cousins. This is illegal, of course, today. Often they married siblings of their dead spouses. The wife died, you married her sister. That kind of thing. You stayed on very good terms with your in-laws because marriages were also combinations of property. So you wanted to marry the daughter of the guy next door because you would inherit a large chunk of that property. Like Massachusetts, the father is the patriarch with total power. He does not work for a living. He is a supervisor if he owns any amount of land at all. And he controls everything. These are isolated plantations. I have a diagram there. I also have a diagram of what the game plan was, an average county with a bird's eye view. Unlike these very close together New England towns, in the South, everything is spread apart because you have usually hundreds and thousands of acres. So you may be miles and miles, and often were, from your nearest neighbor. What goes on in your plantation, nobody knows. Sexual abuse by the males, the adult males of the household, again, this is a college class, so I'm discussing this, was not at all rare. Every plantation, no. Common, yes. So these wealthy large plantation owners would seduce their servants, would seduce their slaves, absolutely. Sometimes visiting women sometimes the wives visiting friends on occasion, their relatives, their neighbors. We have on the books many, many cases of this. A lot more premarital sex. And as opposed to New England, where remember you had those 814 children that the midwife delivered, and there were 7 illegitimate, 10% of the births in most of the southern colonies were illegitimate, were bastard children born out of wedlock. A wonderful case that I just ran across was John Hammond, a well-known South Carolina planter, who raped all 4 of his nieces, never denied raping them, was not taken to court because these were his sister's kids, so it was a family affair. He was elected a representative in South Carolina, and 2 years later was elected governor of South Carolina. And these rapes were on the books as well, and yet he was still elected governor. Women, of course, their role is to obey, obey, obey. And they have even more jobs because not only are they running their own households, they are also responsible for a lot of the care of the slaves. Medical care for everybody, all food and clothing for slaves as well. Divorce, extremely rare, extremely hard to get. Over 100 years of New England history, we have basically a handful of divorces. So these women are stuck and largely uneducated. The sons are educated, the daughters are not. Great story about a marriage in South Carolina. Husband and wife have been married for many years. It's a bad marriage. They're constantly quarreling. And one day they're riding to church in their little horse-drawn buggy, and they're arguing again. And the husband all of a sudden turns the horse's head and starts driving right into the river. And the wife says, Mr. Smith, where are you going? And he says, to hell, madam, I'm sick of you. And the wife says, please drive on, it's better than Virginia. So women are really stuck. Children again, obey, obey, obey. A little more freedom than Puritan children. They are isolated. They pretty much can do what they want on the plantation. And of course, they can boss around slaves at a very early age. They recreated British society in the South. A very few large landowners and a whole lot of poor whites. And on the bottom, you have, of course, slaves. Schools far apart. So you were either educated by a tutor at home or sent back to Britain to be educated. Governor of Virginia in 1660. I thank God there are no schools nor printing presses in Virginia. Learning brings disobedience. We don't want to deal with it, which is a great picture of Virginia. Remember that they are all Anglican. They are all English speakers, English Church of England and English speakers. Attendance was required, absences were fine, but the religion is not literally a burning issue with them. It's okay. You had to attend church. What you did the rest of the time on your plantation was your business. Laws were not based on the Bible, based on English common law, more freedom, less strict. For example, drunkenness was not even punished unless you destroyed property, in which case then you had to pay for the damage. Rape, as opposed to New England, which was a death sentence if you were a married person, rape in the South, in Virginia particularly, was a crime of petty theft. It was a crime, a property crime against the husband, not a criminal offense. And rape of a slave was no offense at all. We are just talking about white women here. So the goal in the South, this is a Southern planter talking. Here's a great snapshot of the South. I only want 1,000 acres of good land, a nice manor house on a pleasant site, 100 Negroes to work the land, a large library, and a lot of friends. End of story. So the South creates a very, very different society than the North. And you can draw a straight line from the 1600s to the Civil War to today in the different colonies. Take care, stay safe.